When they completed the study, they didn't publish the results for 17 years.
Wow, isn't that insane?
They were actively working to suppress the science on this topic. They got the American Heart Association president posing with a bottle of Crisco oil.
Wow.
There have now been more than 20 review papers looking at this data, and they have almost universally concluded. They will try to attack you, attack your character, accuse you of being funded by the industry. That was designed to intimidate and push people out of a field that was being critical of vegetable oils.
Do you feel like the tide is turning and people are starting to see this or not?
The policymakers, the people at the top, refused to even review this literature. They tried to create a drug that would raise your HDL, but they couldn't do it successfully. I mean, it turned out that the drug that they found killed people.
Is that as straightforward a relationship between serum cholesterol and disease as we've been led to believe?
That's not a conspiracy theorist. That's just like the hard reality of large corporations that make money from disease.
Okay, everyone, today we're going to talk to a New York Times bestseller, Nina Teicholz, and she wrote one of my favorite books, A Big Fat Surprise, and really kind of cracked open this whole history and all of the contradictions around saturated fat, animal foods, vegetable oils for the first time. So welcome to the show, Nina. I couldn't be more excited to have you.
Thank you, Autumn. It's great to be here.
Yeah, Nina. So before we begin and get into all of these controversies, can you just tell us what put this whole dietary recommendation, saturated fat piece on your radar to begin with?
I'm a journalist, and I really didn't know anything about nutrition, although looking back, I think I should have, because as a vegetarian for more than 20 years, I definitely had quite a few pounds to lose and was extremely frustrated about my weight and was not particularly healthy. But it wasn't until I was assigned a story on trans fats for a magazine that I started looking into this world of, first it was trans fats, but then it was all fats, good fat, bad fat, non-fat, low fat. I mean, fat is the nutrient that we have been told to obsess about most. And it really drew me in part because the researchers I spoke to this is in the early 2000s when I started looking into this. They were terrified to talk to me. People would hang up the phone on me. People said, if you're going to challenge the low fat diet, I just can't even talk to you. So, I mean, the world, it was so clammed up, and I'm talking about academic researchers in universities that had a fear of discussing the science. So at that point, I'm sure there's a huge story here. And in fact, there was. I mean, it was just an unbelievable story that no matter how many times you write about it, talk about it, you still can't believe it's true. And so it took me about almost 10 years of researching and reading thousands and thousands of scientific studies to write my book. And I've been, stayed and researched ever since in this field. Nutrition is a very interesting field. And, once you dive into it, you're also aware, and this is what's like my next stage, which was like, oh my gosh, I can't understand anything that's going on in the world of nutrition by science alone. So now we have to look at the politics of this world. And that's just this whole other realm, equally interesting.
Yeah, and like I said, your book was the first one I thought that I've read to put it all together, and it just all of a sudden made sense. So can you speak to that fear? Like before we get into the diet heart hypothesis, what was the basis of that fear these researchers had in speaking to you about the low fat diet and why it might not be the right one?
The fear of the low fat diet is the same fear that researchers still have today when challenging the conventional wisdom on saturated fat, on dietary cholesterol, on LDL cholesterol. There is a fear of challenging what is a kind of medical dogma and set of beliefs that are predominant in the field, in anybody's field, in this case, in nutrition. Yeah. Why are they afraid? They're afraid because for very good reasons. They will lose their research funding. They will stop being invited to conferences. They will not get their papers published in journals. I have stories of all of that happening in my book. I have, since my book's publication, been subject to some of those same intimidation tactics, having calls for retraction of my papers, having smear campaigns. This is all part of the corporate playbook, which is they will try to attack you, attack your character, accuse you of being funded by the industry. All of these things have been happening since the 1960s in nutrition and continue to happen today. What all of this, the messages, all of this sends out to researchers in the field is you have to toe the line, you have to go along with the conventional wisdom, and if not, you will be punished.
Yeah. And who is calling those shots? Like, why are people so invested in this low-fat dietary plan?
Well, there are many interests at work here. Probably the most powerful is the US government, the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health adopted the idea that low fat, low and saturated fat, limit cholesterol, that all those ideas were correct, and they control research funding. So if you are a researcher who wants to continue receiving or getting NIH funding, you cannot go far afield in your research from that dominant idea. US government guidelines. There are researchers who do not want to be seen as challenging this incredibly powerful set of recommendations. The food industry, the multinational food industry that produces ultra-processed foods that are bad for health, they are funding an extraordinary amount of research to try to confuse the field of nutrition. They have a set of teams of people who will unleash their, let me give you an example. In my book, I researched how the trade association for the giant vegetable oil companies, so we're talking ADM, Monsanto, Unilever, some of the biggest corporations in the world, they hired experts to go to conferences to heckle academic scientists on stage making presentations, to the point where those scientists said, I got so afraid of publishing anything, it makes you paranoid, is what, quote unquote. That was designed to intimidate and push people out of a field that was being critical of vegetable oils, of this product that this trade association was defending. You also have the pharmaceutical companies that profit from people managing their diseases through drugs and devices and surgeries, and not through food. They really have no interest in you getting better from nutrition alone. I mean, here's just a super obvious example. The insulin manufacturers, every single person who puts their type 2 diabetes into remission, which is possible through diet, that is a lost source of income for the insulin manufacturers. That's not a conspiracy theorist. That's just like the hard reality of large corporations that make money from disease. There's other factors too. There's the animal rights industry that really does not want, very powerful, very well funded, does not want people eating animal foods, and they really would prefer everybody to be vegan. Similarly with the people who are behind reducing livestock or eliminating livestock because they believe it's bad for the planet. I mean, there's just a lot of income streams now that are coming at nutrition without the interest of human health being a factor or even working against it.
Yeah, I think that was so powerful. Thank you for sharing all those crazy details. And I know that these are the present voices, right? And present forces that are pushing this forward. But let's take a step back. Let's go back through history. And where did this idea originate that meat was bad and that saturated fat was bad? And was there evidence of this belief?
Yeah.
Evidence. It's a big one. I know.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Before 1900, in Western cultures, people cooked and ate butter and lard, mainly. That's what they used to cook in the West. In the early 1900s, Procter & Gamble, a soap maker and a tallow maker, formed a partnership and realized that they could take cottonseed oil, which was a leftover from the cotton crop in the South, and they could turn that oil they could harden it and turn it into what was then called Crisco, and sell it as a foodstuff, right? This was in 1911, Crisco was introduced. Before that, the oil had been used to lubricate machinery for the Industrial Revolution, when we hunted out all the whales and there needed to be another source of oil or fat. Suddenly, this is now for human consumption. There had been a little bit of oil consumption. It had been used to adulterate butter. It didn't really come full force into the food supply until 1911. Just so you note, from 1911 until 2000, vegetable oils increased more than any other foodstuff in the American food system. I mean, just since 1970 to today, it's increased by 89%, now stands at nearly 20% of all our calories. It was 0 calories in 1900.
Wow.
So Crisco comes into the food supply, and there's a tremendous marketing campaign behind it, telling American housewives that this was the way to be to assimilate into American society for immigrants. It was new, it was clean, it was not from an abattoir, and it came out of a lab. It was advertised in magazines, an incredible marketing campaign. Vegetable oils are created out of an industrial process that comes out of a factory. It involves deodorization, hydrogenation. It uses a chemical chelate. It's winterized. I mean, it's a very long industrial process. After Crisco, what comes along is margarine. That's in the 1920s, 1930s. That starts to supplant butter because it's cheaper. And then the vegetable oil companies figure out how to sell just the oil itself. So like Mazola oil, Crisco oil in bottles, and they market that for American housewives to fry things in. And this was something that was an incredible discovery for me, which was these oils are very unstable, especially when they're heated. Think back to that chemistry experiment that you did in school. When they're heated, that speeds up the chemical process, which is oxidation. It's the fat molecule opening up and attaching to oxygen. This happens very quickly with vegetable oils, and that oxidation drives inflammation, which is a known source of driver of many diseases, like heart disease. And the inflammatory process is really bad for you. That's why we've been told to take antioxidants, right? Because we want to deal with inflammation. What drives inflammation are these polyunsaturated vegetable oils, probably better called seed oils. Yes. Sunflower, safflower, corn, rice. The most prevalent one in the United States by far is soybean oil. I think a really important point in this history is when Procter & Gamble partners with the American Heart Association in 1948. They make the American Heart Association the designee of this radio contest. And overnight, according to the American Heart Association's own history, millions flow into their coffers and turn them into the nonprofit powerhouse that they are today. They're still the largest nonprofit in the United States. And what was the deal there? Well, for that money, they got the American Heart Association president posing with a bottle of Crisco oil. Wow. According to letters from scientists at the time. And the American Heart Association becomes the main promoter of vegetable oils for health. Right? Before, they had just been a cool thing to use in the kitchen. They were cheaper. Now it was marketed as a product that can lower your cholesterol and spare you a heart attack. It was that kind of advertising was even for children, lower your cholesterol for kids. And these were in ads that appeared in medical journals and in average magazines. That was the real boost that vegetable oils were able to propel vegetable oils into the US food supply, was the idea that they were heart healthy. So at the same time that all this is happening, Ancel Keys, a physiologist from the University of Minnesota, who many people now know, but he was coming onto the scene in the 1950s, and he had this idea that saturated fats and dietary cholesterol were bad for health, right? Where's that found? In animal foods, meat and dairy, eggs. His idea was called the diet heart hypothesis, the lipid hypothesis. And that really, his idea was sort of rose to the fore because he was a very charismatic man. It was said even by his friends that he could argue anybody to the death. And he was very aggressive. He was able to network his way to the President Eisenhower's own doctor, such that when President Eisenhower had a heart attack in 1955 and out of the Oval Office, the whole nation's attention is focused on what causes heart disease, and there is no answer. And into that void steps Ancel Keys with his idea, the diet heart hypothesis, that it's saturated fat and cholesterol that cause heart disease, because those foods will clog your arteries like, oil down a cold stovepipe and clog them, give you a heart attack. And Ancel Keys then, is able to promote his idea into the American Heart Association. He joins their nutrition committee and is able to get them to endorse his idea. And really the first advice anywhere in the world telling people to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol as their primary means of prevention against heart disease came out in the American Heart Association, published in 1961. I mean, that is the beginning of the whole cascade of policies that, that are now global today.
So Ancel Keys came in with this story, with this hypothesis, but was there adequate evidence for this hypothesis? And
Yeah.
was there contradictory evidence?
Such good questions.
It's a big one, I know. Take it away. And I'm not going to step in because I mean, I like you tell stories beautifully. You have amazing analogies. You just go.
Thank you. The question is, what was the evidence when Ancel Keys and the American Heart Association put out this very strong policy statement in 1961? And the answer is, there was one large study by Ancel Keys himself called the 7-Country Study. It's been analyzed by me, by others. The fundamental flaw in it is that shows association and not causation. Right? He purported to show in 7 countries, mainly in Europe, but also the US and Japan, that the more saturated fat you ate, the more likely you were to die from a heart attack or from cardiovascular disease. Those two things he found were correlated. But in the end, I mean, many things could be driving cardiovascular disease. In fact, later in life, he found that sugar or desserts and sweets were better correlated with cardiovascular mortality and death. But he was really focused on proving his idea that it was saturated fat. So when I took a deep dive into the study, I found just a number of really extraordinary details that undermine the quality of his data. For instance, in a study of some 13,000 men, only men that he studied, he sampled the diets of fewer than 500 of them, which is not a statistically representative sample. They sampled the diet using a variety of different methods. They weren't standardized. The questionnaires that they gave to the men weren't reliable. According to Keys himself, he decided he couldn't use the questionnaires. So it was extremely unreliable data to begin with. And then it was parsed through his own particularly biased lens to prove his own hypothesis. I would credit the US government and other governments in recognizing that this evidence from Ancel Keys was actually quite weak. It's not considered high quality evidence. And so there were a number of large randomized controlled clinical trials, sort of grade A evidence, that were undertaken by governments all over the world, Finland, Australia, the US, and England. And these experiments, where they actually had one group eating a diet, what they would consider to be standard amount of saturated fat at the time, which is about 18%. It seems very high to us now, but was considered normal in the 1960s. And then they had a group that had soy-filled cheese, soy-filled burgers, soy-filled milk, their version of the Impossible Burger. They had 9% of calories as saturated fat. That's what we're told about what we're told to consume today.
Yeah.
And in all of those experiments, they did not find that the people who lowered their cholesterol the most and who ate the soy-filled, the vegetable oil-based diet, they did not find that those people died any more from heart attacks than the people who were eating the supposedly cholesterol clogging, artery clogging diets. So reducing saturated fat and cholesterol did not make any difference in terms of your ultimate risk of death from a heart attack. Those results from all those studies from the 1960s and 70s, they were just forgotten. They were called what we call silent studies. They weren't cited. They weren't included in research reviews. Their findings were so inconvenient to so many of the public health authorities that had kind of already decided, they had gotten on the Ancel Keys bandwagon. And so they did not want to find results to the contrary. I mean, there's an extraordinary example of the Minnesota Coronary Study, which was the largest trial of the Ancel Keys' hypothesis. It took place in pretty well-controlled setting in 5 mental hospitals in Minnesota, or where they could control what people ate. When they completed the study, they didn't publish the results for 17 years. Why? Well, they could not find what they hoped to. They did not find that the people who lowered their saturated fat were spared death or heart attacks. In fact, the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the more likely they were to die from a heart attack. But they didn't publish their results. When they did publish them, they put them in a kind of out of the way journal. And when asked why, much later, the lead investigator, Ivan France, said, well, we were just so disappointed in the way it turned out. So that's like emblematic to what happened to all these studies. The data was lost and forgotten. So it really wasn't until journalists, myself and Gary Taubes, his book, where we unearthed these studies, we reviewed them, we brought them to the attention of the scientific community. This is, the 2007 Gary's book, my book, 2014. Since that time, there have now been more than 20 review papers in the peer-reviewed literature by separate scientific teams from all over the world looking at this data they didn't even know existed from the 60s and 70s, and they have almost universally concluded that saturated fats are not associated with heart disease and that they have no effect on cardiovascular or total mortality. Eating saturated fats does not cause heart disease, according to the best available scientific literature.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. So I do want to cover too, and we're going to go into how you worked on those dietary guidelines because that piece is really cool. But I just want to say, how is it possible then? Like, what other evidence are they looking at? Maybe talk about cholesterol. Like, we talk about hard endpoints and mortality. That's what matters, right? But how are these people still believing, some scientists, that saturated fat is dangerous based on, LDL cholesterol, or what are they thinking there?
Right. Well, one thing I want to say is, why do we still have caps on saturated fat? If it's true, we have all these papers concluding the opposite, right? And these papers include papers in very important journals by top nutrition scientists. These are not kind of out of the way minor papers. And the answer to that is that the policymakers, the people at the top, refuse to even review this literature. My group, the Nutrition Coalition, actually worked with some of these scientists, brought them to Washington. They talked to the top people in charge of our dietary guidelines and our policy. And these people, they would not accept these papers as part of the scientific literature that they would review for our policy. They are simply ignoring it, or they're denying it. I mean, I don't know how else to put that. Or
Based on what grounds?
there are no grounds. They will make up sort of specious reasons like, oh, we don't want to look at outside review papers. We're going to do our own reviews. But when they do we actually analyzed for a paper that I was a co-author on. We analyzed their own review of saturated fat. Well, they're not going back to the studies from the 1960s and 70s, right? Because that seems like that's ancient history now, even though those are the most rigorous clinical trials ever done on saturated fats. And they look at the last 5 years of research. And what we found is that 78 to 100% of the papers that they reviewed had no findings against saturated fat on, saturated fat in meat, saturated fat in dairy, saturated fat just as, in butter or any other form. The vast majority did not support the conclusion that saturated fats were associated with heart disease. And yet the expert committee still concluded that the evidence against saturated fat was strong. So they're denying their own reviews of the literature. It's extraordinary. I mean, I think at this point, it's really hard to understand what is going on with the science at that level, because I wouldn't call it science.
Yes, and I love your Nutrition Coalition. I used your saturated paper or your saturated fat kind of summary. So can you tell us, what is the Nutrition Coalition and what is your goal with that organization?
I mean, the Nutrition Coalition is a group that I founded after my book came out, when I hadn't paid much attention to the dietary guidelines, and it's a vastly influential nutrition policy. And, even though most people think it's irrelevant to their own daily lives, the reality is that all your healthcare professionals, your doctors, they consider this to be the gold standard, and they just sort of download it as their nutrition advice. It controls the food supply. It's, when you turn over those packaged foods and look on the back of them, and all those labels are dictated basically by the guidelines. So they're really the most influential policy affecting our whole food supply and what we think is a healthy diet. So these guidelines, when I read the expert report that was coming out right after my book was published, and it was like I had just come out of almost a decade of reading scientific studies, and none of the studies that I had read were in this report. I realized that the dietary guidelines, they had just omitted the vast majority of clinical trials that had been done in nutrition. They never considered their results. The results were inconvenient to them. None of that data was in there. And it was a 480 something page report. And I couldn't get over how contradictory it was, how much of the science was missing, how it just didn't make sense. And I naively thought we have to bring the science to these policymakers. So we started this group, the Nutrition Coalition, and we've done a lot of work. I mean, we got reports by the National Academy of Sciences basically saying there's no methodology to these guidelines that we have that's internationally recognized. We need more methodological rigor. We have guidelines that don't deal with chronic disease. They're only for healthy Americans, which is, now maybe 7% of the population. And yet these guidelines apply to all of us in school lunches and the military everywhere. So we got these National Academy of Sciences reports. We were able to just to identify this as an important issue and really raise consciousness about it in the public. We are the only watchdog organization really anywhere in the world that is bringing a critical eye to these really non-evidence-based guidelines, and there's similar ones all over the world. We we have transcripts of the meetings, we record the meetings, because everything just disappears from the internet. We have engaged in letter writing campaigns. I think we've been quite successful in the area of saturated fat, from preventing the desire to reduce the caps on saturated fat even more. I think, it was our work that prevented that. Will probably take a generation to turn this policy around, given how resistant it is to change, and also how the food industry has really kind of captured this policy. I mean, if you look at the US Department of Agriculture, which is the main administrator of the dietary guidelines, I mean, they have partnerships with virtually maybe like 100 different food companies, including all the large multinational food companies. And we also did a study in which I was a co-author, where we found that 95% of everyone on the expert committee for the most recent guidelines in 2020, 95% had at least one tie with the food or pharmaceutical industries. And more than half of the committee had more than 20 such ties.
Wow. And I'm
So
wondering,
we're talking about a very conflicted set of experts and an institution that really has been captured by the food industry.
well, yeah, absolutely. And maybe do you want to comment on, we haven't even talked about it, so it might be a lot, but Seventh-day Adventist Church and religious beliefs, and do
You
you
know,
feel like that plays in?
I feel like that's really more Belinda's expertise.
Yep.
So, I don't feel like that's kind of my sweet spot. I will just say one thing that, on the Dietary Guideline Committee, there are not just financial conflicts of interest, people getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from food and pharma industries, but there was one member of the committee who is a Seventh-day Adventist, who is actually one of the most prominent professors at Loma Linda University, a Seventh-day Adventist university, which holds the belief that people should follow a vegan diet, that everyone should follow a vegan diet. So in order for there to be sort of their version of the second coming. And this particular, his name is Juan Sabate, and he has been involved in many of the USDA reviews. And when I asked I asked the USDA officials, like, don't you consider that a conflict of interest? I mean, here's somebody who an ideological belief in the vegan diet. How is that person going to be responsive to the science? And they responded, well, we do not want to discriminate on the basis of race, race, gender, or religion. When I was like,
Wow.
well, that wasn't quite my point. I mean, these ideological interests are very powerful, and arguably maybe even more powerful than the financial ties that we've been able to document.
That was perfect. So these guidelines, these dietary guidelines,
Yeah.
they run counter to evolution, in a lot of historical counts around the world. They weren't tested before they were implemented. And sometimes if we reduce saturated fat, we're going to miss out on key nutrients. So can you just comment on, are these dietary guidelines evidence-based as a whole, and do they make sense, essentially?
The dietary guidelines were launched in 1980. And at that time, there were no clinical trials to support that particular viewpoint, that we should cap saturated fat, that we should cap dietary cholesterol, that a diet of more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, low-fat dairy, lean meat, that diet could promote health. There was no evidence for it. And that's been documented in a peer-reviewed paper by Zoe Harcombe. Is there any evidence for the dietary guidelines now? There remains no clinical trials to support this policy. In fact, if you go looking for trials, I can think of two that have been done that are pretty close. Well, one was exactly on the dietary guidelines, comparing it to a diet that they was considered like a bad American diet, lots of desserts, lots of starches, sugars. And the group that was eating according to the guidelines, they did not look any healthier at the end of a 1-year study. I mean, I think there was a slight improvement in some blood pressure measure, but on the whole, they didn't look better than a bad American diet. And then there was the Women's Health Initiative, which was the largest trial ever undertaken by the US, funded by the National Institutes of Health. It was on 49,000 women, where they were just given like a copy of the diet guidelines and told to follow them: more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lower their fat, lower their saturated fat. And there were meaningful changes in the intervention group versus the control group in terms of diet. And at the end of that study, 7 years, they could find no difference. These women were maybe 2 pounds lighter. The diet did not prevent diabetes or heart disease or any form of cancer, and it had actually been powered for cancer, which is quite rare. So that diet had been tested and had been shown to be ineffective for health.
Wow.
Those results from those important studies have never been considered by any dietary guideline committee. The results were just sort of disappeared. And so, what we have is a set of dietary principles that are promoted to everyone in the country that is based on no clinical trials and contradicted now by a couple of important trials. So
That's amazing. Do you have any comments on the Eat Lancet, some of these more recent publications,
Oh,
the global
yeah.
burden of disease, or, the food compass? Anything you
Yeah.
want to say?
Well, I don't know which one of those you want to choose. I mean, I think
Whichever
one
you-
of the things that's very disheartening is that what we are seeing now is really is a move towards vegetarianism, veganism, plant-based, however you want to call it, that is so divorced from the science. Like, that diet has been proven to be nutritionally deficient in important nutrients needed for human life. And also, there are like maybe 1 or 2 clinical trials on the vegan diet. There's almost no rigorous science behind it. It is a diet that has not been tested. And we know historically that there is no human civilization that has survived on this diet a vegan diet for generationally, if not even 1 generation. So it's a fiction. It's not based in science. And yet what we see is, due to this, the tremendous passion behind it from various different sources, as well as a tremendous amount of financing now from the fake meat, fake food companies, and people who believe that animal foods are bad for the planet, and various other sources. It's just a wholesale runaway adoption of that diet at the highest levels. I mean, including by the Biden administration. And the person who is driving this, and is probably the most influential nutrition scientist currently today, is Darush Mozaffarian, who's the head of the Friedman School of Nutrition and Policy at Tufts University. He has been really driving the White House policy on nutrition. He favors a plant-based diet. He talks about the dangers of processed meats, and he thinks red meat is neutral, nothing to eat, maybe nothing to avoid, but he doesn't think it's positive. I think the thing that worries me most about Mozaffarian is that he, in 2021, was the lead author on something called the Food Compass, which was a food rating system from 0 to 100. What scored up at 95 was Cheerios. And in his rating system, and then there was Lucky Charms and Frosted Mini Wheats, and all these were green, eat more of foods, and all of them scored 70 brand name cereals from Post, Kellogg's, General Mills, all scored higher than an egg cooked in butter, all scored much higher than just a hard-boiled egg or cheddar cheese. Ground beef was at the very bottom, red, do not eat, at the bottom of his pyramid. So
is that funding? Is that industry funding at work, or what do you
well,
make of that?
I think, on the face of it, when you're talking about naming cereals by brand name, even if the funding is not overt and it's not declared in the paper, there has to be industry funding behind that, because that so clearly benefits corporations. And it's so insane on the face of it. Like, anybody knows that ice cream or candy covered almonds or chocolate covered almonds, which are, rank high up in his chart, anybody knows that that's not good for health.
Yeah.
And yet this is the most influential person in nutrition today. What that says about where we are in nutrition is really, I think, worrisome and disappointing.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, we shared that Food Compass results on our page in our small wellness sphere, and people were just, they couldn't believe it. But I think other Americans might not be where we are in the wellness space. And so Do you feel like the tide is turning and people are starting to see this or not in the mainstream?
It's hard for me to imagine talking to even, nutrition ignorant person like I was 20 years ago and saying, "Hey, what's healthier? Cheese or ice cream with nuts and chocolate on it." You just like there's hardly anybody you can imagine who thinks that frosted mini wheats are a health food. The overt absurdity of that rating system is something that I think is recognizable to most Americans. But the question is, are we turning towards healthier foods as maybe, you and I would define them, like really nutrient dense foods that are cheese, eggs, dairy, meat. I mean, that's where you get the nutrients that you need for human life and to sustain health. I think there is a groundswell of people that are recognizing that it's not just sugars, but also starches that are kind of the enemy of weight loss. I mean, this is something that most people get into nutrition because they want to lose weight. They need to lose weight for some condition. And I think that these people are starting to recognize, just based on the people around them that have been successful in losing weight. I mean, there's just millions of people now that have understand like sugars and starches drive a metabolic process that leads to overweight and diabetes and poor cardiovascular risk factors and any number of symptoms. I think that's becoming more well known. I would say it's becoming especially well known in the diabetes space. Even the American Diabetes Association say like 30% of their income comes from the pharmaceutical industry. They now have a pamphlet on low carbohydrate diets. So I think we're seeing the tide turn in the diabetes world.
Yeah, that is so incredibly encouraging. And we're going to get to cholesterol, but I do think, because you just brought it up, do you feel as though you have so many great accounts of vegetable oils and their harms? Do you think that vegetable oils are contributing to health detriments as well?
The story of vegetable oils, probably better known as seed oils, the main one that we consume in America is soybean oil. It's a complicated story. The rise in vegetable oils parallels the rise in heart disease in the United States perfectly. Those curves match up almost identically. Their introduction coincides perfectly with the rise of heart disease in the United States. What we know about vegetable oils is that they contain highly unstable molecules, fat molecules that oxidize and drive inflammation. That is a source of heart disease. I mean, we know this from animal experiments. We know this since the 1970s, at least, that there are highly inflammatory products and that cause really toxic oxidation. These are known toxins like acrolein, which is something you get in cigarettes. This science, when I started looking into the science, I realized like it had really been hushed up, and the conferences that you could see in the early 70s sort of disappeared. There was no funding. There was the Institute for Shortening and Edible Oils, which is the trade association for the big edible oil companies like Monsanto, ADM. They were actively working to suppress the science on this topic. I think that the evidence is less firm for vegetable oils causing other problems, although it's suggestive. Vegetable oils do lodge in your cellular membranes in each and every one of your cells, and that is thought to interfere with the mitochondria. And this is research by Dr. Kate Shanahan, and potentially, I think, contribute to obesity. But I don't think that is firm scientific information yet. I think that the strongest link is with heart disease. The other information that we have on vegetable oils is that in all the large clinical trials testing the hypothesis that saturated fat is bad for health, they replace saturated fats with vegetable oils, corn oil, safflower, sunflower oil. And in about 7 or 8 of those trials, the people on the high vegetable oil diet, they died at much significantly higher rates from cancer. And that was an unexpected and unexplained outcome. And it was so worrying to people that the National Institutes of Health had a whole series of very high level conferences in the early 1980s where they tried to explain, like, why are we seeing these higher rates of cancer on the vegetable oil diets? They could not really explain it. They didn't have a satisfactory explanation. And basically their conclusion was it's so important to reduce saturated fats to fight heart disease that we're going to ignore these findings on cancer.
Well, we have a belief that cholesterol, for some people, dietary cholesterol, is a nutrient of concern and something to be limited. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually, dietary cholesterol unbeknownst to pretty much everybody, is no longer a nutrient of concern. If you go back in time, you will see that even in the late 1970s, there was a growing awareness that this belief that dietary cholesterol in egg yolk, shellfish, that it was bad for health, could not be shown to be true. Like they tested that and they could not find that to be true. But it took until 2015 that our dietary guidelines, our official policy, reviewed the data on dietary cholesterol, even though they had been recommending to cap it for decades at that point. And they said they found insufficient evidence that dietary cholesterol is a problem for your serum cholesterol or for heart disease.
Wow.
And that they did another review in 2020, because the dietary guidelines are reviewed every 5 years. And again, they found insufficient evidence to link dietary cholesterol to your blood cholesterol. And yet our dietary recommendations advise diets that are lower in cholesterol. They use those words based on contradicting their own scientific reviews. It's, I think, legitimately confusing to consumers about, what is the real information here. But if you look at the scientific reviews that they've done, they say there's insufficient evidence.
And did they remove a cap? They still recommend low amounts, but did they remove the recommendation to keep
Yes,
it below
that's
300
correct.
milligrams?
Yes. And so, our current guidelines, they no longer have a specific numeric cap on cholesterol, although they say diets should be lower in cholesterol.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's legitimately confusing. Like, you don't understand.
No, it makes no sense. Okay, so what about serum cholesterol? We've talked about a lot of this epidemiological research is saying saturated fats are beneficial because they lower serum cholesterol. So
Right.
is that as straightforward a relationship between serum cholesterol and disease as we've been led to believe?
Yeah, remember the original idea was that it was total cholesterol, that your saturated fat dietary cholesterol would cause your total cholesterol to go up, because they couldn't measure LDL and HDL, different kinds of cholesterol, back in the 50s when the hypothesis came out. By the late 70s, they had been doing these long-term studies. The most famous one and oldest one was the Framingham study. And they discovered that your total cholesterol really was not a good predictor of your heart attack risk. And if you look in the risk calculators that are used today, they don't really look at total cholesterol anymore. But, researchers were able to measure your low density lipoprotein cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, and your high density HDL cholesterol. And so they started shifting over to saying, well, if your LDL cholesterol goes up, that will cause a heart attack. And LDL is raised by saturated fat. Here again, the evidence that came out by the early 1980s from this Framingham study was saying, actually, we do not think that LDL is well correlated with heart disease risk. And if you look at all the indicators, HDL is a much better predictor of your overall cardiovascular risk. There's a lot of nuances to this story, but one of the short answers is the pharmaceutical industry, they tried to create a drug that would raise your HDL, but they couldn't do it successfully. I mean, that it turned out that the drug that they found killed people. However, what is the biggest blockbuster selling drug of all times is statins, which lower your LDL cholesterol. So there was a tremendous amount of money that was behind this LDL cholesterol theory, even though it has not been found to reliably predict heart attack risk. I mean, what's been found is that just as many people get heart attacks who have lower LDL as have high LDL. LDL is not actually measured, it's calculated, it fluctuates quite a bit, it can be manipulated through diet. Maybe one of the most important things to note is that even though there might be some benefit from statins in lowering LDL cholesterol, that effect has never been found when you lower your LDL cholesterol with diet. So whatever is going on with statins, which may be through LDL, maybe through some other mechanism, which is called the pleiotropic effect, that effect is not seen with diet. In many, many studies, they cannot find that lowering your LDL lowers your heart attack risk.
Are there dietary factors that can raise HDL if, in fact, having higher levels of HDL is protective?
Yeah, I mean, HDL, it turns out, is protective against having a higher HDL is definitely protective. It used to be that you would go to your doctor, and if you had low HDL and you'd ask, how do I raise my HDL? They say, well, you can do some exercise, maybe drink red wine, but there really was never a good way, a dietary way to raise HDL, because doctors didn't know that saturated fat raises HDL cholesterol. And really, it is the most effective and perhaps the only food that will raise your HDL cholesterol. So if your HDL is low, not to go out and eat sticks of butter, but don't fear those foods that contain saturated fat, because those will raise your HDL cholesterol.
Right. And there's a lot of doctors who say, yeah, like you said, LDL is calculated. There's oxidized LDL, there's insulin resistance. Are there other parameters that you think might be more insightful as it pertains to your real risk than LDL cholesterol or total cholesterol?
The standard risk factor panel that is done by your doctor, the most important measurements to look at are your HDL cholesterol, that should be fairly high. It's different for men and women. And your triglycerides, which is a measure of the fatty acids in your blood, which is driven, ironically, by your carbohydrate intake. Your triglycerides should be low. You don't want to have a high level of fatty acids in your blood. And those two measurements are the best predictor for cardiovascular risk. That's been shown in multiple studies. I think if you're getting a more sophisticated panel, you can look at your LDL cholesterol subfractions. And this is one of the other reasons for why you shouldn't fear saturated fat, because it turns out that LDL is much more complicated than we think. And due to the work of Ron Krauss, scientist at UCSF now, he found that there's kind of dense LDL, like hard dense LDL, and kind of light fluffy LDL. And your saturated fat intake will increase the light fluffy kind, which is not the kind that drives cardiovascular risk. It's really like the small, dense LDL that is driving your cardiovascular risk. And that actually is reduced when you eat saturated fat.
Beautiful. And are all saturated fats
very well done
the same? Are they the same on health? Do they have the same effect on health? And do you think trans fats being lumped in with saturated fats could have maybe made people more afraid of them?
The question of different kinds of saturated fats is one that I think there's a difference of opinion on. In my opinion, if you look at the largest and longest, most rigorous clinical trials from the 1960s and 70s, they lumped together all saturated fats from dairy, from meat. They tested them all together and they did not find any ill effect on cardiovascular outcomes. That to me is the most definitive, rigorous, long-term evidence on humans that we have. So I don't think that separating out different kinds of saturated fatty acids is particularly important. Although, I'm aware people talk about MCT, but I think, the bottom line message is that they can't find any ill effects of any kind of saturated fat in the largest and longest clinical trials on humans. Trans fats have been eliminated from the food supply, are not really relevant anymore. And they are not at all like saturated fats. I mean, there should be no lumping together of those two. They're different molecules. They're produced through different processes. Trans fats are generally come from an industrial process. Saturated fats occur naturally in food. So, I mean, there's really no relationship between the two, except for kind of rhetorically, there's been an effort to kind of throw saturated fats in with trans fats and kind of tar them, with the same brush. But I don't think they're related in terms of biochemistry.
Okay, last question. Are you ready? You've done great.
Yeah.
It's just, what would you tell someone who is still avoiding animal products for fear of saturated fat or cholesterol in the name of their health?
As a former vegetarian myself, I'm extremely sympathetic to people who just have this kind of gut belief that meat must be bad for health and animal products in general are probably going to give you cancer or heart disease. But having spent so much time in the scientific literature, going back to unearth a lot of kind of hidden, suppressed, ignored data, and then seeing the reevaluation of that data by scientific teams all over the world to conclude that saturated fats and dietary cholesterol really are not driving heart disease, do not cause cancer, do not cause any kind of ill effect on human health. I think what we are seeing now is an inability for that science to kind of penetrate at the policy level where more people could know about it. But the science at this point is really strong that there are no ill effects of those natural substances in natural foods.
Oh yeah. And let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, I've been a fan of your work for a long time. So we'll just
Thank you.
keep this
All
relationship
right. Well, I
going.
look forward to being a fan of yours. So
Okay.
all
Bye,
right.
Nina.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.